August 18th, 1962, 2:13 p.m. The air in the south yard of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was thick enough to taste. A cocktail of Georgia humidity, coal dust from the prison's power plant, and collective human misery. Warden David M. Heritage stood on the second-story catwalk of C Block, his knuckles white on the iron railing. He was 5'9", with a Marine Corps posture that the years and the bureaucracy had failed to bend. Below him, 200 inmates milled in the oppressive heat. His eyes, however, were fixed on one man, Vito Genovese, inmate number 724-5-1-L. He wasn't sitting on a bench like a king holding court, surrounded by sycophants. That was the Hollywood version. The reality was far more unsettling. Genovese was walking the perimeter of the yard, alone, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore standard-issue prison denim. He was 65 years old, paunchy, with a face like a bulldog that had lost its last fight. He looked like any other aging convict doing his time, but he was not. Heritage watched as Carmine Galante, a younger, harder man from a rival faction, swaggered toward Genovese. Galante was serving 20 years, also on a narcotics charge. He was 5'6" of pure, uncut ambition, with a reputation for violence that preceded him like a shockwave. Two of his men, both built like brick shithouses, flanked him at a respectful distance. The yard quieted, not suddenly, but in a slow, spreading ripple, like a stone dropped in a stagnant pond. Conversations tapered off. The clank of weights in the workout area ceased. Every eye, inmate and guard, turned to the two men. Galante stopped directly in Genovese's path. He didn't speak. He just smiled, a predator's smile, and spat on the ground, less than an inch from Genovese's worn-out shoe. It was the ultimate gesture of disrespect, a declaration of war in this concrete kingdom. Heritage tensed. His hand instinctively went to the riot stick at his belt. His guards on the ground moved, ready to intervene. Genovese did not flinch. He did not look at the spittle. He did not look at Galante's men. He slowly raised his eyes and met Galante's gaze. For 3 full seconds, he just looked at him. There was no anger, no fear. There was something else, something cold and analytical. It was the look of a biologist studying a specimen under a microscope just before dissecting it. Then, he did something no one expected. He smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible twitch of the lips, a private acknowledgement. Then he simply stepped around Galante and the glob of spit and continued his walk as if the man did not exist. Galante's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of confused rage. He had expected fear, or anger, or a challenge. He had gotten nothing. He had been dismissed, humiliated by sheer indifference. He turned, about to scream something, but his own men held him back, shaking their heads. The moment was over. The challenge had been made, and in a way that no one could quite articulate, it had already been lost. Up on the catwalk, Warden Heritage felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the suffocating heat. He had seen prison fights, riots, and murders. This was worse. This was the quiet prelude to something terrible. He wasn't just watching a power struggle between two convicts. He was watching a master at work, and he knew, with a certainty that turned his stomach, that he was utterly powerless to stop what was coming. What nobody in the Bureau of Prisons understood, what the history books written by the victors will never tell you, is that when the United States government sentenced Vito Genovese to 15 years in prison on April 17, 1959, they did not cage a lion. They handed a master strategist a new, smaller, more controllable chessboard. They thought they had removed the king from the board. In reality, they had just given him a fortress. To understand the events of August 1962, you must first rewind to 1946. Vito Genovese, nicknamed Don Vitone, returned to the United States from Italy. He had fled in 1937 to escape a murder charge, a charge that was conveniently dropped when the key witness was mysteriously poisoned in a Brooklyn jail. While in Italy, he had played both sides of the war, ingratiating himself with Benito Mussolini before flipping to assist the United States Army after the Allied invasion. He returned a wealthy man, ready to reclaim what he believed was his, the top seat, the boss of the Luciano family, which was being run by the elegant Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. But Costello ruled through political influence and diplomacy. Genovese believed in a different kind of power, the kind that came from the barrel of a gun and the unwavering loyalty born of absolute fear. He spent the next decade consolidating his power base. He was patient, methodical. He placed his loyalists in key positions. He studied the routines of his rivals. He identified their weaknesses. He was a creature of pure, predatory logic. While Costello was charming senators, Genovese was building an army. The first move was on May 2nd in 1957. Frank Costello was walking into the lobby of his apartment building, the Majestic, on Central Park West. A black Cadillac pulled up. A man stepped out, a large, shambling figure later identified as Vincent the Chin Gigante, a Genovese soldier. He called out, "This is for you, Frank," and fired a single shot from a .38 caliber revolver. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp. It was a miracle he survived. But the message was not in the kill. It was in the attempt. It was a demonstration of reach. Costello, the untouchable prime minister, could be touched. Shaken, Costello understood the game was over. He quietly ceded power to Genovese and retired to his poultry farm. Genovese was now the acting boss. But there was another power in New York. Albert Anastasia, the fearsome head of the Mangano family and the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Incorporated. Anastasia was pure volatile ID. He was a killer, not a thinker, and he was a Costello ally. Genovese knew Anastasia would never accept his leadership. So Anastasia had to be removed. October 25th, 1957, 10:15 a.m. The barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel on 56th and 7th. Anastasia sat in barber chair number 4 for his regular trim and shave. He was completely relaxed, his eyes closed under a hot towel. 2 men, scarves covering their faces, walked in. They bypassed the register, the other barbers, the other customers. They walked directly to Anastasia. They fired 10 shots. Albert Anastasia died on the checkered floor of the barbershop, a bloody towel still around his neck. The hit team was rumored to be Joe Gallo and his brothers, acting on the orders of Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, but everyone in the underworld knew who had sanctioned it, who had given Gambino the green light and promised him the family in return. Vito Genovese. With Costello retired and Anastasia dead, Genovese was the undisputed capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. To cement this status, he called a grand summit of every major mafia family in the country. The meeting was to be held in the rural, quiet town of Appalachian, New York, at the home of a mid-level boss named Joseph Barbara. It was to be Genovese's coronation. November 14th, 1957. It was a catastrophe. A curious state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed dozens of luxury cars with out-of-state plates descending on the tiny town. He set up a roadblock. The most powerful gangsters in America, men who controlled empires of crime, were suddenly scrambling through the woods in their $1,000 suits, trying to escape a handful of small-town cops. Over 60 were detained. The Appalachian disaster was a public relations nightmare. It exposed the existence of the Mafia to a skeptical American public and an enraged J. Edgar Hoover. It was a humiliation for Genovese. He had consolidated power only to prove himself incompetent at hosting a party. His rivals, like Carlo Gambino and Meyer Lansky, saw an opening. They had attended Appalachian, but they blamed Genovese for the fiasco. They saw his ambition as a liability. The federal government, now fully awakened to the threat, put its entire weight into taking Genovese down. They couldn't get him for murder. They couldn't get him for extortion. So they did what they always do. They found a loose thread and pulled. The thread was narcotics. Genovese had long preached a public rule against dealing drugs, calling it a dirty business. In reality, he controlled a massive importation network. The feds, likely with a quiet tip from Genovese's rivals, found a low-level dealer named Nelson Cantelops. They squeezed him hard. They offered him a deal. Testify that you bought your heroin directly from Vito Genovese, and you walk. It was a lie. A man like Genovese would never meet a street-level dealer. But it didn't matter. The jury believed it. On April 4th, 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. On April 17th, he was sentenced to 15 years and fined $20,000. He was sent first to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, a grim, granite fortress known for housing the country's most difficult prisoners. The government celebrated. The newspapers ran headlines, "The End of a Kingpin." His rivals, Gambino and Lansky, breathed a sigh of relief. They had successfully used the government to eliminate their primary competitor. They assumed he was finished. A 62-year-old man sent to a maximum security prison. His reign was over. This was their fatal miscalculation. The Atlanta Penitentiary in 1960 was not a correctional facility. It was a warehouse for human beings deemed beyond repair. It was run by a rigid, underfunded bureaucracy and populated by a violent, stratified society of inmates. Power inside the walls was a mirror of power outside, but stripped of all pretense. It was about who controlled the flow of commodities: cigarettes, extra food from the kitchen, drugs smuggled in, protection from assault. When Genovese arrived, the prison's internal economy was controlled by a loose coalition of bank robbers and toughs from Chicago. The top dog was a man named Carmine Galante. Though a mafioso himself, from the Bonanno family, he had been in the system for a few years and saw himself as the true power in Atlanta. He saw Genovese not as the boss of all bosses, but as a new fish, an old one at that. Galante made his move almost immediately. He controlled the flow of commissary, the goods inmates could buy. He jacked up the prices for Genovese's men, the soldiers and associates who had been swept up in the same narcotics conspiracy or were already inside for other crimes. He ensured they got the worst cell assignments, the hardest work details in the textile mill or the laundry, where temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. a systematic effort to dismantle Genovese's prestige and show everyone that the old man's power ended at the prison gate. Galante was arrogant. He believed in muscle and overt displays of force. He saw Genovese walking the yard, reading in the library, keeping to himself, and mistook silence for weakness. He saw discipline as fear. The final provocation came in July of 1962. A new shipment of high-grade heroin had been smuggled into the prison, baked into loaves of bread from an outside supplier. It was worth a fortune on the inside. The operation had been arranged by Genovese's people on the outside, a message to the organization that he was still in control. The drugs were his. Galante decided to take it. On July 28th, at 7 p.m., during the shift change, two of Galante's men cornered the inmate responsible for distributing the shipment in a utility closet near the infirmary. They didn't just take the drugs. They beat him. Badly. They broke his jaw and 3 of his ribs. They left him unconscious on the concrete floor. It was a message. This prison belongs to me. Your boss is a relic. This was the inciting incident. The direct challenge that could not be ignored. It was a move born of pure hubris, the fatal flaw of the underestimator. Galante believed he had cornered a king. He had no idea he had just stepped into a meticulously prepared trap. The news of the beating and the theft reached Genovese within 10 minutes. It did not come from a guard or one of his known associates. It came from a man named Hector Ramirez, an inmate of 22 years, serving a life sentence for a bank robbery in 1940. Hector was 68 years old. His official job was a janitor in the medical wing. He was stooped, quiet, and wore thick glasses. He was invisible. No one, not the guards, not the other inmates, knew that Hector Ramirez's daughter was dying of leukemia in a hospital in Savannah. And no one knew that for the past year, an anonymous benefactor had been paying for her experimental treatment, the best care money could buy. All Hector knew was that once a month, a lawyer for Mr. Genovese would ask if his family needed anything. Hector Ramirez was Vito Genovese's eyes and ears in the infirmary. He saw everything. He heard everything. He reported everything. Genovese received the news in his cell. C block, cell 114. It was 8 feet by 6 feet. A cot, a toilet, a small metal desk bolted to the wall. His loyal enforcer, a man we will call Tommy Grimaldi, a former boxer doing 10 years for hijacking, stood at the bars, his face a mask of fury. "They spit in your face, Vito," Grimaldi seethed, his voice a low growl. "They take your package and they break one of our guys. You give me the word, me and 2 others. We can take Galante in the shower tomorrow morning. No one will see a thing. A shiv in the ribs. It's over." Genovese was sitting on his cot, reading a book. It was The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. He slowly placed a strip of paper to mark his page and closed the book. He looked at Grimaldi, his eyes calm. "And then what, Tommaso?" he asked, his voice soft, almost didactic. "He has a dozen men. You kill him. One of them takes his place. Then they kill you. Then I have one of my men kill him. It's a slaughterhouse. It's stupid. It's what he wants." "So we do nothing?" Grimaldi asked, incredulous. "We let him run this place. We look weak." "Weak?" Genovese smiled that cold, analytical smile. "No, we will not look weak. We will look like ghosts. We will look like gods." He stood up and walked to the bars, his face inches from Grimaldi's. "He thinks this is a street fight. He thinks power is a fist. Power is knowledge. Power is making a man's own body betray him. It's making his own men hand him to you. He wants to be king of this sewer? Fine, we will let him be king for a little while. And then we will take his crown, his men, and his dignity. And we will do it without throwing a single punch. This was the dilemma. The brutish solution was easy, obvious, and ultimately a losing move. It played into the antagonist's strengths. Genovese rejected it. He would choose the elegant solution, the one that required intellect, patience, and a profound understanding of human weakness. For the next 3 weeks, Genovese did nothing. He continued his daily routine, the walk in the yard, the hours in the library, the quiet meals in the mess hall. To Galante and his crew, it was confirmation. The old man was broken. He was afraid. His time had passed. They grew bolder, more arrogant. They openly mocked Genovese's men. They flaunted the stolen heroin, selling it at a premium, cutting the Genovese loyalists out completely. But Genovese was not doing nothing. He was activating his network. His first piece of information came from Hector Ramirez, the janitor. Galante had a severe allergy to penicillin. It was noted in his medical file. A single dose would not kill him, but it would cause a violent, systemic reaction. Hives, difficulty breathing, extreme disorientation. His second piece came from an inmate named Sal, who worked in the prison laundry. Sal was a degenerate gambler who owed money all over the prison. Genovese, through an intermediary, had his debts cleared. In return, Sal reported that one of Galante's top lieutenants, a man named Frankie the Pipe, had a terrible fear of being sent to solitary confinement, what the inmates called the hole. His brother had hanged himself in a solitary cell in another prison years earlier. His third and most crucial piece of intelligence came from a source no one could have ever predicted: a correctional officer, a young guard named Miller. Miller's wife had a gambling problem. She owed $3,000 to a loan shark in Atlanta. A loan shark who, on the outside, answered to the Genovese family. One evening, Miller was approached by a lawyer. Not threatened, just informed. His wife's debt was forgiven. In return, all he had to do was provide a schedule. The schedule for unannounced cell inspections in C Block for the month of August. And one other small favor. Genovese now had the pieces of his plan. It was a 3-pronged strategy designed not just to eliminate Galante, but to utterly dismantle his operation and turn him into a pariah. It was a plan of exquisite psychological cruelty. Phase 1 was codenamed The Ghost. Genovese had Grimaldi acquire a small amount of powdered penicillin from an orderly in the infirmary. It cost 5 packs of cigarettes. This was not for Galante. It was for the heroine. Grimaldi, under the cover of night, would use a straw to blow a fine dusting of the powder into the small glassine bags of heroin that Galante's men were selling. It was an infinitesimal amount, not enough to be seen, smelled, or tasted, but enough to trigger a reaction in someone with a severe allergy. Genovese was poisoning the well, but only for one man. Phase 2 was the whisper. Genovese instructed his men to start a rumor, a quiet, subtle rumor, that Galante was holding back the best of the stolen heroin for himself, that he was cutting the product he sold to his own crew, keeping the pure stuff for his personal use. To make the rumor stick, Genovese had one of his outside contacts send a message to the family of one of Galante's own men, saying he had been shortchanged. The seed of distrust was planted. Phase 3 was the trap. This was the masterstroke. Using the schedule provided by Officer Miller, Genovese knew there would be a shakedown of C Block on August 18th, sometime in the afternoon. He instructed Tommy Grimaldi to approach Frankie, the Pipe, Galante's lieutenant, who was terrified of the hole. Grimaldi was to offer him a deal. The deal was simple. Grimaldi would give Frankie a package to hold, a small, sealed package. Grimaldi would claim it was a stash of high-end contraband, some jewelry, and cash. He would tell Frankie that he was worried about the shakedown and needed a safe place for it. He would offer Frankie a generous cut just for holding it for a few hours. The package, however, would not contain jewelry. It would contain a prison-made knife, a 6-inch shiv, wrapped in a cloth that had been handled by a dozen other inmates to obscure any prints. And Grimaldi would make sure that another of Galante's men saw him give the package to Frankie. Then, Genovese put the final piece in motion. He sent a message to Officer Miller, the small favor. Miller was instructed to anonymously tip off the captain of the guards that Carmine Galante was planning to stab a guard during the afternoon shift on August 18th. The tip was to be specific. Galante would have one of his men hold the weapon, and the attack would happen during the yard time count. The board was set. Every piece was in place. Galante, blinded by his own arrogance, was walking into a checkmate he couldn't see. He thought he was playing checkers. Genovese was playing three-dimensional chess. Now, if this story is getting you hyped, and you're starting to see how a real grandmaster operates, do me a favor. Hit that like button real quick. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you're new here, and you love these kinds of hidden histories, make sure you subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's return to the yard. August 18th, 1962, 2:13 p.m. We are back at the moment of the confrontation. Carmine Galante spits on the ground in front of Vito Genovese. Genovese gives him that cold, dead-eyed smile and walks away. For Galante, this is the final insult. The old man is mocking him. He decides then and there to accelerate his own plan. Galante's plan was brutish and simple. He was going to have Genovese shanked during the evening meal. But first, he needed a fix. The stress of the confrontation, the public dismissal, it made him crave the drug he now controlled. He stalked back to his cell, furious. He barked at one of his men to bring him his personal stash, the pure stuff he had skimmed from the top. At 2:45 p.m., in the privacy of his cell, Carmine Galante cooked up a small amount of the heroin that had been invisibly dusted with penicillin. He injected it into his forearm. The reaction was almost immediate. Within 2 minutes, his skin began to itch. Red welts erupted on his neck and arms. His breath grew ragged, each inhalation a painful whistling gasp. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The room began to spin. Panic set in. He stumbled out of his cell, clutching his throat, his face swelling, his eyes wide with terror. He was suffocating. He collapsed on the walkway of C Block, convulsing. His own men stared in horror, backing away. They had been hearing the whispers for weeks, that Galante was using the best stuff himself. Now they saw this. They didn't see an allergic reaction. They saw a man poisoned by his own tainted product. They saw a man who had overdosed on the very drugs he was supposed to be expertly managing. The rumor Genovese planted now looked like undeniable fact. Guards rushed to the scene. Hector Ramirez, the janitor, was already there with his mop. watching from a distance, his face impassive. A medical emergency was declared. Galante, barely conscious, was hauled onto a stretcher and rushed to the infirmary, where he would be pumped full of adrenaline and antihistamines. He would live. But his reputation as a competent drug kingpin was dead. At the exact same time, another part of Genovese's plan was unfolding. The anonymous tip from Officer Miller had sent the prison administration into a frenzy. The captain of the guards, a man named Reynolds, was taking no chances. He ordered an immediate, full-scale shakedown of C Block, just as Genovese had known he would. The afternoon yard time was canceled. All inmates were ordered back to their cells for a lockdown and inspection. The guards, on high alert and expecting violence, were brutally efficient. They tore cells apart. They frisked every inmate. When they got to Frankie, the pipe, they were not gentle. Frankie, already terrified of being caught, started sweating profusely. The guards noticed. They strip-searched him. Taped to the small of his back, they found the package. Inside was the 6-inch shiv. Frankie, the pipe, began to panic. He knew what this meant. Possession of a weapon intended for assault on a guard was an automatic 5 years in solitary. The hole, the one place on earth he could not handle. "It's not mine! It's not mine!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Grimaldi gave it to me. He said it was jewelry. It was a setup." The guards looked at each other. Of course he would say that. They always did. But Captain Reynolds was listening. He had a tip about Galante planning an attack. Now he finds a weapon on one of Galante's top men. It all fit. "Who was the target, Frankie?" Reynolds demanded, his voice like ice. "Tell me who you were supposed to hit, and maybe I can help you." Frankie was sobbing now, a pathetic, broken man. He didn't know about the tip. He didn't know about the larger plot. All he knew was that he was holding a knife that wasn't his, and he was staring into the abyss of solitary confinement. He had to give them something. "It was Galante's order," he blurted out. "He wanted a guard taken out, to show everyone who runs this block. It was all him. I was just holding it." It was the perfect lie, because it was exactly what the guards already believed to be true. The trap had been sprung. Frankie had implicated his own boss in an assassination plot against a federal officer, the most serious crime one could commit inside a prison. The reveal was complete. In the span of 30 minutes, without laying a hand on anyone, Vito Genovese had dismantled his rival's entire operation. Galante was in the infirmary, discredited as a junkie who overdosed on his own supply. His top lieutenant was in an interrogation room, confessing to a phantom plot. His crew was scattered, leaderless, and suspicious of one another. And Vito Genovese? He sat on his cot in cell 114, reading Machiavelli, The Picture of Innocence. When the guards searched his cell, they found nothing but a book, a bar of soap, and a spare set of clothes. He was polite, compliant, and utterly serene. The aftermath was a study in silence. Carmine Galante was eventually released from the infirmary, but he was a broken man. He was immediately placed in administrative segregation, pending an investigation into the plot to kill a guard. Frankie, the pipe, having confessed, was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, to serve his time in the newly opened Supermax facility. He was spared the hole in Atlanta, but sent to a far worse version of it. The news spread through the prison not like wildfire, but like a slow, creeping fog. There was no celebration, no gloating from Genovese's men. There was just a quiet, universal understanding. The old man was not to be touched. He was not to be challenged. His power was not of this place. It was absolute. The guards felt it most acutely. They reviewed the incident reports, a drug overdose, a found weapon, a snitch's confession. On paper, it was all routine prison drama. There was nothing, not a single shred of evidence, to connect any of it to Vito Genovese. Yet they all knew. Warden Heritage sat in his office, reading the reports over and over. He saw the timeline. He saw how perfectly the events had dovetailed. He felt like a man who had witnessed a magic trick and was now trying to deconstruct it, only to find there were no hidden wires, no secret compartments. It was just pure, impossible skill. He was no longer just a warden. He was the caretaker of a monster he couldn't control. The guards stopped looking at Genovese as a prisoner. They started looking at him as a force of nature, like a storm on the horizon. They weren't afraid he would stab them. They were afraid he could have them transferred, fired, or have their lives on the outside ruined with a single whispered order. A fear far more potent than any shiv. A week later, Tommy Rimaldi stood at Genovese's cell. The block was quiet. The new hierarchy had been established without a single memo. "I don't understand, Vito," Rimaldi said, his voice full of awe. "Why Frankie? Why not just plant the shiv on Galante himself?" Genovese looked up from his book. He delivered the lesson. "Because a king does not get his hands dirty. You plant it on Galante. He denies it. It's his word against ours. But you have his own man, his trusted right hand, confess that Galante ordered the hit. You destroy his credibility. You destroy his loyalty. You make his own strength, his crew, the instrument of his downfall. You don't just remove the man. You erase the idea of the man. That is power, Tommaso. The power they can never lock in a cage." The legend was solidified. Vito Genovese had not just survived prison. He had conquered it. He turned the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary into his new headquarters. From his 8 by 6 foot cell, he continued to run the Genovese crime family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. His orders, passed through coded letters, crooked lawyers, and visiting family members, were carried out on the streets of New York City. He sanctioned hits, approved new members, and directed rackets earning millions of dollars a year. He even found time for revenge on a grander scale. In 1962, his former soldier, Joe Valachi, became a government informant. His testimony at the McClellan Committee hearings famously exposing the inner workings of the organization he called La Cosa Nostra. From his cell in Atlanta, Genovese placed a $100,000 bounty on Valachi's head. The fear of this bounty was so great that Valachi, even in protective custody, once mistook another inmate for a Genovese assassin and bludgeoned him to death with an iron pipe. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun. It's not a bomb. It's knowing what a man fears, what a man loves, and what he believes, and having the patience to use all of it against him. Vito Genovese was a master of that weapon. He understood that true control was never about brute force. It was about perception, psychology, turning your enemy's mind into a prison more secure than any fortress of concrete and steel. Vito Genovese never tasted freedom again. He was later transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He died there of a heart attack on February 14, 1969, at the age of 71. He died a prisoner, inmate number 724-5-1-L. But he died as he had lived for the final decade of his life, as the undisputed boss, his crown invisible, his kingdom a state of mind. His final, concluding anecdote is not in a quote, but in the prison records themselves. For years after his death, new wardens in the federal system were briefed on the Genovese incident, a cautionary tale not about an inmate, but about a ghost who could bend the bars of his own cage. They didn't build a prison to hold him. He built a throne inside theirs,